There are moments in global economics when you can feel the ground shift beneath your feet, and tonight is one of those moments you do not want to miss. Because while the headlines in Washington have been dominated by victory speeches, tariff triumphs, and bold promises, something far bigger and far quieter has just erupted north of the border. And if you care about geopolitics, markets, or Canada's place in the world, what happened over the last few days is the kind of plot twist you'll want to rewind and watch twice. For weeks, American commentators have been celebrating what they call the most successful tariff push in decades. Former President Donald Trump told crowds that duties on foreign goods were pouring in historic amounts of cash. Enough, he said, to one day replace income taxes. He insisted that America was rewriting the rules of global trade and that skeptics were simply choosing the wrong side of history. It was a confident message, a triumphant message, and it was everywhere. But while that narrative dominated U.S. screens, analysts missed a storm forming quietly across the 49th parallel. In Canada, expectations were bleak. Economists were predicting growth of 0.5%, barely above stall speed. Every major bank projected softness across the board. Some even whispered the word recession. Then the number hit. Not 0.5, not 1.0, but 2.6%. A surge more than 5 times what experts expected. A shock strong enough to jolt currency markets, push up bond yields, and force research desks to tear apart their models. Suddenly, the story flipped. The pressure campaign aimed at Canada didn't crack the economy. Instead, it ignited something completely different. And as the dust settles, the question lingering tonight is simple. If the United States believed tariffs were closing in, how did Canada end up outplaying the entire board? The pressure had been building for months, and if you were watching only the U.S. news cycle, you might have believed Canada was inching toward a breaking point. Washington tightened its tariff grip, 10% here, 25% there, covering steel, aluminum, autos, and anything else politically symbolic. American pundits claimed the strategy was working. They pointed to headline numbers suggesting tariff revenues nearing $95 billion a year, insisting that Canada, more than any other U.S. partner, would feel the squeeze first. And on paper, it sounded convincing. Canada's economy had been slowing through the summer. Consumer spending dropped for 2 consecutive quarters. Housing construction hit a multi-year low. Business investment stalled to nearly zero growth. By early fall, Bloomberg surveys were giving Canada a 60% probability of slipping into a technical recession. The narrative was clear. Pressure goes up, Ottawa buckles. But that assumption began to crack the moment Washington faltered. The U.S. federal government shut down, halting the release of America's own GDP report, leaving analysts, investors, and journalists staring at an empty calendar. Consumer confidence in the U.S. slid to its weakest level in almost a year. Job growth cooled. Inflation worries picked up again as tariffs pushed up input costs. Even tourism, one of America's soft power pillars, showed signs of strain. German bookings into the U.S. dropped at a double-digit rate as political tension made the country a less attractive destination. Meanwhile, the conversation at the northern border shifted. What was once portrayed as Canada's vulnerability began to look more like Washington's blind spot. Instead of folding under U.S. tariff pressure, Canada was quietly adjusting, rerouting trade, strengthening secondary markets, and accelerating diversification strategies that had been simmering in policy circles for years. And as each new indicator rolled in, a pattern became impossible to ignore. The leverage the U.S. assumed it had over Canada wasn't behaving the way it used to. The old playbook was slipping. Canada was not bending. It was repositioning. While the U.S. broadcasted its tariff victories with bold headlines and louder speeches, Canada's countermove didn't arrive on a podium or through a press release. It arrived quietly, through numbers, through trade flows, and through a sudden shift in economic momentum that no one south of the border expected. And if you were watching closely, you could see the moment everything flipped. Because just as Trump described tariffs as a financial revolution, as something powerful enough to reshape America's entire fiscal system, Canada unveiled an entirely different kind of response. Not a retaliation, not a political confrontation, something far more surgical. The country's growth engine came to life in 2 places. Washington had almost completely ignored. The first was energy. With the Trans Mountain expansion and Line 3, adding roughly 590,000 barrels per day of new capacity. Canadian crude exports surged 6.7%. Billions of dollars in additional output flowed into the quarterly GDP. Global buyers, especially in Europe and Asia, were snapping up Canadian supply, eager for stability in a market rattled by geopolitical risks and shrinking inventories. The U.S. could tax metals, it could pressure autos, but it couldn't stop the world from buying the oil it needed. The second engine was public investment. Ottawa didn't hesitate. Infrastructure spending jumped, hospital expansions accelerated, military procurement projects kicked in. In total, government investment rose 5.1%, enough to offset private sector slowdown and push growth into positive territory. It wasn't flashy, but it was decisive. Canada using fiscal muscle not as a reaction, but as a stabilizer. And that was the twist. While the US celebrated tariffs as leverage, Canada advanced in areas that couldn't be tariffed at all: energy, infrastructure, long-horizon national capacity. A slow, steady buildup that didn't shout for attention, but delivered results too large to ignore. The campaign meant to corner Canada had triggered the opposite. A quiet counterstrike built on strengths the U.S. had underestimated. The deeper you looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-off GDP surprise. It was the early phase of a structural realignment, one that had been forming beneath the surface while Washington focused on tariffs and televised victory laps. And, for the first time in more than a decade, the map of Canada's economic dependencies began to redraw itself in real time. Across trade networks, the shift was unmistakable. For years, roughly 75% of Canadian exports flowed to the United States. But by late 2024 and into 2025, that share slipped to 68%, the lowest level in 15 years. Not because Canada was turning away, but because new markets were turning toward Canada. Shipments to the European Union climbed at their fastest pace since the CETA agreement took effect. Exports to ASEAN economies reached an all-time high, and India, once frozen out by diplomatic tensions, was re-emerging as a major buyer of Canadian staples. At the same time, new sectors were stepping into roles few expected. Tourism, often dismissed as secondary in economic war narratives, became one of Canada's biggest surprise weapons. German visitors, long considered high-value long-stay travelers, shifted away from the United States after a double-digit drop in bookings, and Canada captured the momentum. Overall, foreign tourism surged 12%, delivering billions into local economies and reinforcing something crucial. Political stability had become a global selling point. Inside Canada, the momentum spread. Energy infrastructure positioned the country as a reliable supplier at a moment when the world desperately needed reliability. Government investment improved long-term productivity. Trade diversification reduced exposure to U.S. shocks. And all of it was happening faster than any previous economic cycle, compressed into 12 to 18 months instead of a decade. One by one, the old assumptions began to fall apart. Canada wasn't simply weathering U.S. pressure. It was using the moment to shift its economic center of gravity. A pivot, not away from America, but toward a more balanced position in a fractured global economy. And the striking part was how synchronized it all felt, like separate trends suddenly locking into formation. A structural shift hiding in plain sight. A country repositioning itself long before Washington realized the board was changing. For months, analysts assumed one thing was certain. The diplomatic freeze between Canada and India was too deep, too poisoned, and too politically costly to thaw anytime soon. China had already imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian peas. India added duties of 30%, choking off a cornerstone of prairie agriculture. Farmers talked openly about abandoning pulse crops entirely. Washington quietly calculated that the Canada-India rupture would weaken Ottawa's leverage in Asia for years. But then the story swerved, fast. Barely months after Mark Carney stepped into office, a set of quiet diplomatic signals began to surface. No fanfare, no press blitz. Then came the moment no one expected. India's High Commissioner traveling to Saskatchewan, standing in front of farmers who had braced for another decade of losses, and telling them point blank not to scale back production. India, he said, needed long-term supply. Reduced tariffs, renewed quotas, and a revived agricultural partnership were all back on the table. And that wasn't even the biggest move. Behind closed doors, negotiators were drafting the framework for a 10-year uranium agreement worth up to $2.8 billion. a deal that would tie Canada directly into India's accelerating nuclear expansion. A complete reversal of the geopolitical mood from just months prior. For the US, this was an unexpected twist. Washington's tariff play assumed Canada's global options were shrinking. Instead, they were widening, and fast. Canada wasn't only restoring a broken relationship, it was anchoring itself to one of the world's fastest-growing markets in energy, agriculture, and strategic goods. This wasn't diversification for show, it was diversification with teeth, capable of reshaping Canada's long-term economic trajectory and insulating it from the very pressure the U.S. believed would force capitulation. A turning point disguised as diplomacy. A door reopening wider than before. The moment Canada proved it was not reacting to U.S. leverage, but rewriting the map of its own future. By the time the numbers settled, the narrative had already moved beyond GDP charts and tariff rhetoric. What was unfolding felt bigger, like a country quietly stepping into a new phase of its economic identity. For years, Canada had been framed as the junior partner in North American trade, the economy most exposed to U.S. policy swings, the one expected to feel tariff pain first and recover last. But over the past 18 months, that entire storyline has started to loosen, thread by thread. The data tells the story plainly. A growth surge of 2.6% in a quarter that was predicted to flatline. Energy exports rising 6.7% just as global supply tightened. Government investment climbing 5.1%, injecting resilience into a slowing private sector. Foreign tourism jumping 12%, boosted by geopolitical spillover few analysts had priced in. And a full-scale reset with India, complete with reduced agricultural duties and a potential $2.8 billion uranium partnership, shifting long-term demand into Canada's favor. But beyond the numbers, something more foundational is happening. Canada is no longer positioning itself as a reactive economy shaped by U.S. pressure. It's repositioning itself as a stable hub in an increasingly unstable world. A reliable energy supplier when the global market is tense. A politically steady destination when travelers seek predictability. A diversified exporter at a time when single market dependence has become a strategic liability. This isn't decoupling. It's something more subtle and more strategic. A quiet broadening of economic gravity. A recalibration of risk and opportunity. A transition from a single anchor trade model to a multi-lane network that connects Europe, South Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and a reshaped North American relationship. Not hostile, not confrontational, simply more balanced, more deliberate, more durable. And ironically, the catalyst for this shift wasn't Canadian ambition alone, it was pressure from the very tariffs meant to constrain it. That's the part Washington didn't expect. That in the face of economic coercion, Canada wouldn't retreat or absorb the hit. It would accelerate, diversify, and ultimately outmaneuver. So as we close tonight, one question remains hanging in the air. If this is what Canada can build under pressure, what happens when it starts shaping its future without it? Thank you for watching. If you want to follow how Canada's economic strategy continues to evolve, and how the next moves in this North American power game unfold, make sure you subscribe, share this breakdown, and stay with us for the next chapter.